So we learned a little bit in last class about what an oligopoly is. It's when a small number of firms, of large firms, this is when a small number of large firms have most or all the sales in an industry. We talked about how if oligopolists compete hard, they act similar to perfect competitors. If they collude, they act similar to monopolists, right? We talked about how collusion is when firms act together, specifically when they're acting together to reduce output and keep their prices high. So the biggest people that participate in this are the oil-producing, exporting countries, right? The OPEC cartel. It's a group of countries, a group of oil-producing firms that have a formal agreement to limit their output and sell at the monopoly price. This is an illegal activity, but international law is the greatest joke of law, right? There's no real such thing as international law. So this is illegal in the United States, but it is not illegal in these other countries. So when we're talking about oligopolies and we're talking about these small number of firms, part of what we are learning about is the fact that the firm's decisions are no longer isolated. So what this means is that the decision of one firm now has a very real impact on the profits of another firm. So this is what we call interdependence. And it's a difficult thing for us to, just coming out of the gate understand. And so we have a time-tested rite of passage that we're about to go through here. On our way to actually learning about oligopolies and how oligopolies use game theory, we have to take a little bit of a step back and think about the origins of game theory and think about a very, very simple game. So the most simple game that we have is called the prisoner's dilemma. What color should I use? So I don't know if you all, it used to be very popular, it might not be anymore, but there was a show, Locked Up Abroad, right? Where it'd be these horror stories and they'd reenact them, but it'd be, these two friends, they go to Thailand together, right? And, something happens, maybe, they have drugs on them or whatever the case may be, and they get arrested, right? These two friends get arrested and they are given choices, right? So in the prisoner's dilemma, we have prisoner A over here, and prisoner A has a couple of choices that are presented to them. So prisoner A can choose to remain silent, or they can confess. And then, very symmetrically, we also have a prisoner B. And prisoner B also has a couple of choices. Prisoner B has the choice to remain silent or to confess. And these people are taken into separate rooms and they are told, well, if you confess, we'll give you a deal. If you confess and the other person stays silent, then we're only going to give you 1 year in jail. So one of the things that's a little frustrating about the prisoner's dilemma is this is a golf situation, right? The lower number is better. We're talking about years in jail, so the lower number is better. So B gets 1 year of jail if they confess. But if they confess and prisoner A remains silent, then they're going to give A 8 years. So be clear on that. So the decision so the outcome for prisoner B is not only dependent on the choice that prisoner B is making, right? These choices are also called strategies. So the result is not just what they choose as their strategy or their choice, but it also depends on what prisoner A does, right? They only get 1 year if prisoner A remains silent while they are confessing. Questions on this? Okay. What if they both remain silent? Well, if they both remain silent, then A is going to get 2 years, and B is also going to get 2 years. And then, since this is a symmetrical game, they don't favor prisoner A over prisoner B. They don't favor prisoner B over prisoner A. So they offer the same deal to prisoner A. They say, hey, if you're willing to confess, we will give you a deal and let you out after 1 year. But if they confess while the other one chooses to remain silent, that means that just like before, right, when A got 8 years, B got off with only 1, but A got 8 years. Similarly here, A can get off with only 1, but then B is going to get 8 years. Is everybody clear so far in terms of just how I'm setting this up? The choices, the strategies. These things in the boxes here, these are called payoffs. And then the last one that we have is if they both decide to keep their clap shut, A is going to get 5 years, and B is also going to get 5 years. If they both confess, yep. Or sorry, yeah, not if they keep their trap shut. If they keep their trap shut, they get 2 years each, right? If they remain silent, they get 2 years each. But if they both confess, then essentially the authorities have enough material on both of them to give them both 5 years, right? So the authorities, the 1 year offer essentially gets rescinded, right? It was not offered in good faith. And so if both of them confess, then they end up getting a punishment of 5 years each. Thank you for that. Yeah, I completely misspoke. So now, what do we do with this, right? It's one thing to understand it and to build it. It's another thing for us to figure out what to do with it, right? And so I'm going to get rid of this payoff circle just because it's a little frustrating. So we've got A, 5 years, B gets 5 years. Okay. So what do we do with this now? Well, one of the first things that we're asked in these types of situations is we're asked, is there a dominant strategy? And specifically, we're going to be asking, is there a dominant strategy for player A? And then we'll ask the same question, is there a dominant strategy for player B? And so the way in which we do this is we have to put ourselves in a world where we think that the other person has already chosen. So that's why I have this ruler up here to cover up this other quadrant, right? We're going to say that we're going to be in prisoner A's shoes, right? We're going to use the green pen for this one. prisoner A's shoes. And we're going to say we are assuming that prisoner B is going to remain silent. So in the scenario where prisoner B, remains silent, what is prisoner A going to want to do? They're going to compare remaining silent and getting 2 years punishment compared to confessing and getting 1 year's punishment. So what are they going to do? They're going to confess, right? They're going to get 1 less year, even though it makes them a snitch. There's no reputational impact on this, right? You can do this. You can do this without having people become aware that you're a snitch.
Well, at least prisoner B won't get out for a long time.
That's true. That's true. And now we're going to say, what about the other situation? What if we assume prisoner B is going to confess? So I cover up the other 2 payoff squares of the matrix, right?
So they probably confess as well.
They would confess as well. Why? Because 5 is less than 8, and we're playing a golf game here. 5 years of jail is better than 8 years of jail. So we're going to put another underline over here. And then we're going to take this ruler away, and we're going to say, are both of the underlines corresponding to a strategy? And they are, right? In this particular situation, they absolutely are. Both of these underlines correspond to the strategy of confess. If the other person remains silent, it's in the person A's advantage to confess. If the other person confesses, it's in the person A's best interest to also confess.
But they'll still get. But if they. Oh no, that's if you remain silent, right?
Right. So if you remain silent, that would be the way. If both of them. So if they were to. If they were able to create an agreement and say, let's remain silent together and enforce it, then they could do the remain silent and get 2 years. But the problem is that you don't know if the other person's going to confess or not.
Yeah, so on the top one, on that side, does prisoner B confess and then prisoner A remain silent?
Over here?
On the top and on the...
This one?
On this side. Right there.
So this would be prisoner B confessing and prisoner A remaining silent. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, prisoner B...
It kind of just gets... Oh, okay, never mind. I see what it is now.
Okay. And so then we want to evaluate and say, well, okay, we see that prisoner A has a dominant strategy. What about prisoner B? Does prisoner B have a dominant strategy, right? So again, we cover up half of the matrix. We switch over to blue pen because we're prisoner B now. Instead of underlines, I'm going to do overlines just because sometimes we don't have colored pencils in these situations, right? So got to have a way to do it if we just have one pencil.
So if they confess, they'll get less time, right?
Exactly. Very good. So if we assume that prisoner A is going to remain silent, prisoner B, by confessing, is going to get 1 year instead of 2 years, right? So prisoner B, at least when prisoner A remains silent, has a dominant strategy, or sorry, not a dominant, we're going to get there, has a strategy of confessing. Now we have to figure out, well, what happens if prisoner A decides to confess? Well, if prisoner A decides to confess, prisoner B is going to take a look at remaining silent and getting 8 years, or confessing themselves and getting 5 years. So prisoner B, seeing that confessing gives them 5 years, they're going to go ahead and they're going to confess and get 5 years instead of the 8 years, which would have been their alternative, right? In the scenario where prisoner A is already confessing, prisoner B is incentivized. The only rational choice for prisoner B to make is to also confess. So then we're going to take a look at our strategies for prisoner B and look at the overlines and say, do either one of these strategies have 2 overlines in them? And they do, right? Confess has an overline for the scenario where prisoner A remains silent, and it also has this overline for the scenario where prisoner A decides to confess. And so we would say that yes, there is a dominant strategy for prisoner A, and that is to confess. Yes, there is a dominant strategy for prisoner B, and that is also to confess. Now, here's where game theory gets a little tricky. There was this guy named John Nash. He was the subject of a book and a movie called A Beautiful Mind, which doesn't hold up terribly well because of some of the gender role stuff in there, but he was a very famous economist, and part of his breakthroughs that he had in his dissertation research was looking at and really developing this whole economic science of game theory and how to analyze this. And so specifically, one of the things that Nash looked at was, what would an equilibrium look like in a game theory scenario? Right? What would equilibrium look like in a game theory scenario? Because, we know what equilibrium looks like with demand and supply, right? X marks the spot. It's the price that clears the market. It's the price where there's no excess supply and the price where there's no excess demand. But what the heck does it mean for them to be in an equilibrium when they're at a game theory scenario? So we're going to talk about this in the confines and the perspective of Prisoner's Dilemma, and then we're also going to talk about it as it relates to actual oligopolists' decisions in a second. So just because, so a Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies that result in a payoff such that no one player has an incentive to deviate. So a Nash equilibrium is a set of strategies that result in a payoff such that no one player has an incentive to deviate. What the heck does this mean in plain English, right? Well, let's take a look at each one of the possible strategy combinations that we have, right? We really only have 4 possible combinations. We have remain silent, which is this box right here. We have confess, remain silent, which is this box. We have confess, which is down here. And we have remain silent and confess, which is up here. So essentially we have 4 different set of strategies to evaluate. Because also, here's the annoying thing about Nash equilibria, there can be more than one. So there can be more than one in a payoff matrix. So what we do is we kind of circle one, and we say, is this a Nash equilibrium? Is there any unilateral incentive to deviate from this? Is there any reason for prisoner A, if they found themselves in this situation where they were remain silent, if they could go back in time and only change their own actions, would they do so? 50-50 shot.
I guess it depends on who the other person is.
Like
if
if
it's
they
somebody
were,
they care about, then they'll just throw them under the bus. But
or like if they were bros, they'd probably tell each other like.
But it's not enforceable. I mean,
Okay.
if we were talking about, we could up the stakes of this, right? And so instead of being 2 years, it could be 20 years. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I mean, we could up the stakes to the point where even if you're a part of, some sort of, secret society or blood pact or whatever the case may be, like you still can't actually rely on the other person doing what you said you were agreeing to do, right? It's unenforceable. By nature, it's unenforceable. And I mean, people flip on their brothers and sisters and parents all the time, right? To keep themselves out of jail.
Is that why, like, whenever they're trying to get someone's confession, they would go in there and they would lie and say the other person confessed already, and that it would cause them to.
Yeah, they don't have to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
There's nothing in there saying they just can't beat you, right? They just can't physically harm you anymore. But no, they don't have to tell you the truth 100%. That's why you always want a lawyer there, right? If you ever are in that situation where they're saying, oh, your buddy, blah, 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 he already confessed against it, you need a lawyer yesterday. You are not equipped to handle that yourself. I'm not equipped to handle that myself, right? But let's get back to this particular scenario. If we're in remain silent, what would happen if prisoner A decided to deviate unilaterally and confess? What would happen to their punishment?
If which player?
If player A decided to go from remaining silent to confessing, but we assume that player B was still remaining silent, what's that going to do to the prison time for player A? It's going to bring it down, right? So there's a rational incentive at this particular juncture for player A to change their mind and confess. So as a result, this is not a Nash equilibrium, because there's an incentive for at least one player to deviate. Now, is there an incentive for the other player to deviate? Yes, there is, right? If we put, shoe on the other foot, if we said, does prisoner B have an incentive to deviate from this equilibrium, right? If prisoner A is stuck with choosing remain silent, prisoner B is absolutely going to want to change their mind to confess so they can get 1 year of prison time instead of 2 years of prison time, right? So this is, for multiple reasons, not a Nash equilibrium. So then we're going to go to the next spot. And we're going to say, is this a Nash equilibrium, right? Well, we know that prisoner A doesn't have an incentive to deviate from this particular strategy, right? Because we literally just talked about the payoff if they did deviate. If they deviate from confessing, then they're going to be right back up here, and we know that that's not desirable. So really, this question has to do with player B, right? If player B finds themselves in this payoff matrix, are they going to want to have gone back in time and chosen a different strategy?
Probably not, because they already got the best one. Or you said player A or player B?
Player B.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Yeah, because 5 years is less than 8 years, right? So player B has an incentive to deviate from this strategy set. Similar, there's an because of the fact that this is symmetric, there's the exact same thing happening here, right? Player A has the incentive to deviate from remaining silent and getting 8 years. They have the incentive to deviate and to confess and get 5 years, because 5 years is less than 8, and we're playing golf here, lower scores are better. So this is also not a Nash equilibrium. So last but not least, is this a Nash equilibrium? If player A were to choose a different outcome, they would be here getting 1 year. Or sorry, no, that's wrong. If player A were to choose a different outcome, they would be here getting 8 years rather than 5 years.
Maybe a yes, because they both can get less time.
Yes, because well, it's not that they. Yes, it's that there's no incentive for them to deviate, because we see up here, this is the way to get the least amount of time, right?
Yeah, because they'll
Is to get the 2 year, but it's not sustainable. It's not enforceable. And so this is a Nash equilibrium because, yeah, it would not make sense for prisoner A to choose to change their mind and to remain silent and get 8 years instead of 5. And similarly, it would not make sense for prisoner B to change their mind and get 8 years by remaining silent compared to the 5 years they're currently getting by confessing. So this is a Nash equilibrium. Here's a frustrating part. Right now, the Nash equilibrium is the combination of the two dominant strategies, right? We see that. The dominant strategy is confess for A, the dominant strategy is confess for B, and then the Nash equilibrium is confess, confess. I have to tell you that that is not always going to be the case. We're not going to get to it in this class. It's more advanced than this class, right? But I just want to stress that dominant strategies do not make Nash equilibria. Nash equilibria have to do with a unilateral incentive to deviate. So you will find, like say you decided that you really like this, and I don't know, like you took more econ or stats classes or whatever, right? Like there will be situations where there will be two Nash equilibria and one dominant strategy. There will also be situations where there's one Nash equilibria, one Nash equilibrium, and no dominant strategies, right? So I just want to separate those because, especially in this model, right, it's all so clean, and it all ends up being like, oh, dominant strategy, boop, those point to the Nash equilibrium. No, not the case. Nash equilibrium is a separate evaluation than evaluating the dominant strategies. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone?